In this video, we'll cover the concept of utility, marginal utility and total utility. Now, what is utility? Utility is the one satisfying power of a commodity. Whenever you consume a commodity, you derive a certain amount of satisfaction from the consumption of that commodity. That satisfaction is known as utility. Now, it depends on the intensity of wants. Now, what does that mean? Suppose you are in a desert and you are in search of water and you get some water to drink and you're thirsty as well. So, the amount of satisfaction that you'll get from the first sip of water or first glass of water will be very high. The amount of satisfaction that you derive from the second glass of water will be less as compared to the first glass of water. The amount that you derive, the amount of satisfaction that you derive from the consumption of 10th glass of water will definitely be very less than the amount of satisfaction that you derive from the first glass of water. So you can clearly see that the satisfaction depends on the intensity of wants. When you're thirsty, then the intensity of the want is very high. But when you've had like 4-5 glasses of water, after that the intensity of the want reduces. So when the intensity of the want is high, the amount of satisfaction that you derive from the consumption of the commodity is high. And when the intensity of want is low, then the amount of satisfaction that you derive from that commodity is low. Now, utility is subjective in nature. What does that mean? Suppose I love chocolates and you don't like chocolates. So when I love chocolates, then the amount of satisfaction that I'll derive from the consumption of the chocolate will be very high, and the amount of satisfaction that you will derive from that consumption will be less. Now, whenever we talk of utility and the amount of satisfaction that we get, it is very imaginary in nature. That is, you cannot have a specified amount that can measure that, right? So, it is measured in an imaginary unit called utils. Okay. Now, first let's just cover the concept of marginal utility. Now, what does marginal mean? Marginal means a small change. So, in our context, marginal will mean change in commodity consumption by 1 unit. Okay. So what is marginal utility? That is the marginal utility that you will derive from consumption of an additional unit of a commodity. The emphasis is on an additional, that is on 1 additional unit of the commodity. For example, we have a chart like this. You consume the first glass of water, the second glass of water, third glass of water, fourth, fifth, sixth and seventh glass of water. This is the total amount of utility that you get from the consumption of the commodity, and these are measured in utils. Okay, these are measured in utils. So the amount of satisfaction that you derive from first unit of the commodity is 10. This is the total utility. The amount of satisfaction that you derive from the second unit of the commodity is 18. This includes the amount of satisfaction that you've derived from the first unit of the commodity. Now, when you consume the third glass of water, this is the total utility that you get from the consumption of third unit plus second glass plus the first glass of water. When you move on to the fourth unit, the total utility tells you the amount of utility that you derive from the consumption of fourth glass of water, second, third and the first glass of water. Now, whenever we talk about marginal utility, it is an addition to the utility derived from consumption of an additional unit of a commodity. So, suppose that you want to find the marginal utility from the first unit of commodity, right? It will be total utility that you derive from 1 unit of the commodity, first unit of the commodity, and the total utility that you derive from 0 unit of the commodity. In this case, the amount of utility that you derive from 0 consumption is 0. The amount of utility that you derive from first unit of the commodity is 10 utils. So marginal utility from first unit of the commodity will be equal to marginal utility from first unit of the commodity, total utility from the first unit of the commodity minus total utility from the 0 unit of the commodity, which will be equal to 10 minus 0, which is equal to 10. Similarly, when you want to find the marginal utility of the second unit of the commodity, that means that you want to find, the way to find is total utility that you derive from the second unit of the commodity and the minus the total utility that you derive from first glass of water, which is equal to 18 minus 10, which is equal to 8. Now, let us move on to this. Marginal utility from the fifth unit of the commodity is equal to total utility from fifth unit of the commodity minus total utility from fourth unit of the commodity, which is 26 minus 25, which is equal to 1. Now, there is a stage where the amount of utility, total utility that you derive from the consumption of a commodity is equal to the total utility that you derive from the consumption of the previous unit of the commodity. In this case, when you drink fifth glass of water, the total utility is 26. The amount of utility that you derive from sixth glass of water is again 26. That means that there is no addition of utility when you have consumed an extra unit of water. Now, if there is no addition in the utility, the marginal utility is 0. This is marginal utility from 6 is TU6 minus TU5, which is equal to 26 minus 26, which is equal to 0. Okay. Now, sometimes what happens is that you keep on consuming the commodity and then you reach a point where the consumption of the commodity does not add to the utility, but it reduces your total utility. Now, in that case, the marginal utility of the commodity becomes negative. Suppose you've been forced to have the 7th glass of water and you do not need that 7th glass of water. And still you're being forced to consume it. So the total utility that you get from the consumption of the 7th glass of water is less than the utility that you get from 6th glass of water. So the marginal utility is negative. Just remember. So what is total utility? Total utility is the summation of all the marginal utilities of all the successive units consumed. For example, total utility for commodity 4 will be the marginal utility that you get from commodity 2 plus marginal utility that you get from commodity 2, 3 and 4. Now in this example, what do we see that if you want to find the total utility of commodity 1, then it is the total utility, it is the marginal utility of commodity 0, which is you don't know, because when you just start from 0 units, there's a slash here, plus the marginal utility that you derive from first unit of consumption of that glass. Now total utility for commodity 2 will be TU2 will be MU1 plus MU2, which is equal to 10 plus 8. Similarly, The total utility that you derive from consumption of third unit of the commodity will be marginal utility that you derive from first unit of the commodity plus marginal utility that you derive from second unit of the commodity plus marginal utility that you derive from the third unit of the commodity, which is equal to 10 plus 8 plus 5, which is equal to 23. Let's just do it for the last 7th unit. The total utility from consumption of 7th unit of the commodity is MU1 plus MU2 plus MU3 plus MU4 plus MU5 plus MU6 plus MU7, which is equal to 10 plus 8 plus 5 plus 2 plus 1 plus 0 minus 3, which is equal to 23. Similarly, for this, it will be 10 plus 8 plus 5 plus 2 plus 1, right? So this is how you derive total utility from numerically. Now, in the next video, we'll cover the relationship between total utility and marginal utility.